Hey guys! So in the second part of the tutorial, I'll be finishing up these bases and these wolves. So I have 3 wolves that I have dry brushed. And the second step I'll be doing on them is to add the wash. And so for these wolves, the reason that I dry brush them first is because when I apply the wash, I want the wash to kind of bring everything together, bring all the colors together, and kind of mute the intensity of the wash. As opposed to on the bases, I did the wash first to seep into all those nooks and crannies, and then when I do the dry brushing, I want that to really pop so that I have a really dramatic difference between the nooks and crannies and the highlights from the dry brush. So I have 2 dry brushes here. I'm going to be using the bigger one, and so I'll just start with one of these bases. And so I have my base, I have my paper towel ready to go, so I'm using Terminus stone. So I'm just going to pop that open, and I'm going to dip my brush in here, wiping off the excess. I also use this to kind of like get more paint deeper in the bristles. And then I'm going to wipe off a lot of this excess on my paper towel, and then pick up my base and then just lightly go back and forth, and you can see instantly I'm picking up all that great detail that I had glued down in my earlier tutorials. So picking up all those edge highlights, just working my way around, so working around the edge, just really trying to pick up all those highlights, all those edges. So that's it. I mean, look at how amazing that looks. I love dry brushing. Instantly makes things look so good. So because I did the wash first, you can see it really soaked into all of these little nooks and crannies and made them really dark. So when I do the dry brush on top of that, it's such an amazing dynamic range of shades there. So that's the small one. So I can do the same exact thing on this repulsor base. So again, have my dip my paint, kind of work it into the bristles of the brush here, wipe off a lot of this paint. And then so with this one, because it's so big, I'm just going to work on it kind of in sections. So again, too much paint, so you want to be really careful. Don't have too much paint on the brush because you'll be putting down more paint than you intend. And so yeah, so just really lightly working the dry brush over these surfaces. Can change the direction that I'm going. So left to right, out and in. And so with this one, because it is so big, I'm probably going to need to go back to my pot multiple times, wiping off that excess, working the paint into the bristles, and just very lightly covering all this stone. So just really working my way around this base, going slow, using a lot of patience, because you don't want to overdo it with the dry brush. Don't want to accidentally paint like an actual brush stroke onto this. So wiping off my brush on the paper towel and picking up all the highlights on these rocks, going around, working my brush multiple directions. So almost done. With this, it's so big, I think I'll probably want to do a second go around and really get a good coat of dry brushing here to really accentuate all this detail. So that's after one coat. Looks pretty good. I think for this larger base, if you compare that to this base, I really like the kind of highlights I'm getting on these stone surfaces. So I think I just need to spend more time, kind of working my brush. Well, maybe I don't need a second coat. Maybe I can just do it right now just by focusing on those flat surfaces. So just working my brush around them. Yeah, it's looking pretty good now. Okay, maybe I don't need a full second coat, just a little bit more paint on here. So, a little bit more paint on these rocks. Okay, yeah, so I just needed to focus a little bit more on these rocks, really bring out the details in them. Cool, so there's the repulsor base. So I'll do the rest of these bases off camera. So here's the before and after. So this just is the wash. This is with the dry brushing effect after that. So I'm gonna just clean my brush off. So now we'll move on to the wolves. And so on these bases, I started with the wash and then I did the dry brushing effect on top of that to have a really dynamic value structure between the two. But for the wolves, I don't want them to be that intense. And I think their colors are going to be kind of just inherently more intense, especially on this black one. So by doing a wash on top of the dry brushing, I'm going to darken up the dry brushing and really tie this whole kind of model together. So again, using Adrax Earth Shade. Oh, that's Flesh Shade. Let me grab my Earth Shade. Good thing I checked, although that probably would have looked fine. Okay, so the Adrax Earth Shade is the one I'm using. Give it a good little shake. And so I have this, massive shade brush that I used on the bases. That's too big for these wolves. So I'm going to be using a number 3 Series 7 brush because I want a lot more control with these wolves. And I'll do it on this brown one because I think that'll probably be the most interesting. So open this guy up. I'm going to get a lot of shade on my brush. And so I'm going to just work this into all of the recesses of this wolf. So just going over the whole model, letting it seep into the fur, all these nooks and crannies. I don't want it to like totally pool like it's starting to do here, but I can just kind of continue to work it through the model, spreading that out over the whole model so I can kind of lay it down pretty thick, but then just keep working it to spread that paint out. And so here, you should be able to see it's kind of, it's going over the dry brushing, so it's kind of dimming it out. Put it on all the metal bits, kind of make them a little oily. Don't want it to totally cover it, so just kind of, working it into the recesses. You can kind of, plop down a lot of shade, but then just, constantly be moving your brush around the model to move that massive droplet into the rest of the crannies. So, and you definitely want to pay special attention to details like in this ear. It's kind of a line pattern. So I just want to make sure that I get enough paint in there, also on this muzzle. I want the earthshade to seep into all those little holes so that it picks up all that detail and again kind of creates a really nice value structure there, so that I have really dark darks and bright whites or bright silvers, so that there's a lot of interesting detail to look at in this model. I'm getting this undercoat here. Really looking to see like where the earthshade is pooling, making sure it's pooling in the places that I want it to. It's not kind of pooling on flat surfaces, it's that it's seeping into nooks and crannies, again to bring out the great detail that Games Workshop puts into these models. So I really want to accentuate that, and the Games Workshop sculptors are much better artists than I am a painter, so I want to really leverage their skills to my advantage, which is why I use dry brushing a lot, inks or shades a lot, so I really can accentuate all the great detail that they put into these models. Let's see, back here needs a little bit. So I think I've covered most things, so when you're at this point, keep looking, rotating the model, turning it upside down. You may think you got everything, but there might be this little patch of fur right between his legs, a little hard to see. For these ribs, these kind of metal ribs, I want to make sure there's a nice beat or fill of shade in between each ribs. Here I want to make sure there's a nice shade there. So kind of just like tying the whole model together with this shade and making sure that I'm using it to seep into places that are going to accentuate the detail around the teeth, the metal bits. So I think that looks good. So you can probably compared this wolf to what it was in the beginning of the video. We've really muted that bright dry brush. So the dry brush now has a level or a coating of shade on it, so it's really tied it all together. And so then in the final step, what I'll show you is spraying this model with a matte finish, because I've found that the Agrax Earthshade dries with a very high gloss. So this guy, even when he's dry, is going to look very wet, which is not a great look. But I'll show you how we can easily spray him with a matte finish, and that'll cut down the glare and the gloss on this model. So there's the two approaches. You can see the dramatic differences between the two. So on the wolf, dry brushed first, and then did a wash to tie the whole model together. On the base, where I want a more dynamic, interesting kind of difference between the dark darks and the light lights, I did the wash first to seep into everything, and then I did the dry brushing on top of that so that it really picks up all the highlights. So that's kind of the difference between the two approaches, between doing a wash first or a dry brush first. So hopefully you can add that to your repertoire. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of these on camera, and I'll be back to show the matte finish process.